Between the boroughs of Weymouth and Portland lies a pleasant tarmac track known today as the Rodwell Trail. In its present form, it's nothing more than a quaint thoroughfare, lined with trees and wildflowers, that ferries pedestrians and cyclists along the length of Wyke Regis. Not long ago, though, the course was home not to dog-walking locals or ambling tourists, but to clattering steel engines powered by diesel and steam. Like most of the country's rail network, it was built in the 1800s by the like of Brunel and his peers. Of course, it seems a bit daft to say it was these men who built it. Truth is that while they might have designed the stations, plotted the routes and found the finances to fund it, they'd never have deigned to place their pampered hands on a shovel or lay a section of track. That work, the real work, was done by an army of men known as navvies, itinerant men desperate for a wage, exploited by those whose hubris led them to believe they were better than. Working 18 hours a day in all weathers, breaking their backs and bloodying their hands, they built the railways from the ground up, and for their trouble were condemned to the most miserable of lives. It should be no surprise, then, that the camps they erected alongside the tracks were haven to all manner of violent debauchery. After all, you treat a man like an animal long enough, that's exactly what he'll become. It was into one of these camps that a young man came with his wife and young children to work and build a better life for his family. No one now remembers his name, but there were so many young men like him it matters little in the grand scheme of things. He came with his dreams in tow, just like they all did. Modest dreams, but hopeful nonetheless. A warm cottage, some land, food enough for his loved ones, and a little security in their old age. Not a lot to ask, one would think. At first, these dreams seemed to be as attainable as his next meagre meal, but bit by bit they evaporated before him. First he lost his left eye in a blasting accident, followed in short order by 3 fingers on his right hand and a sizable portion of his ear. He didn't lose anything that stopped him working, mind. Not until the day a barrow slipped from another's grasp and shattered his pelvis. It managed to heal without gangrene setting in, but it never healed right, and from that day on walking was a thing of the past. Instead, he'd use a rough-hewn piece of timber as a makeshift crutch and travel after a fashion by pivoting upon it like an unsteady top. Of course, while he couldn't walk and he couldn't work, he could still lift a pint pot, throw a dice and hold a hand of cards. He even won a little at first, but drunken, bitter men make poor gamblers. So, what little his wife and young'uns were able to earn was soon swallowed by his vices. The warnings from his creditors were friendly at first, just a quiet reminder spoken softly, but soon their patience ran thin and the threats began. Simple at first, but more inventive and terrifying as time ran on. At first he discarded them, but he soon learned what boiling pitch could do to a man's skin, and what chisels could do to his toes. If he'd had the money, I like to think he would have paid them, to avoid what was to come if nothing else. But the truth is that the young man with dreams we met earlier was long gone, usurped by a fetid, pitiable fetch that wore his face, and any coin that graced his pocket was soon exchanged for a drink. So, despite the tortures and despite the threats, the gangs and the gamblers he owed went unpaid, and they were not the type to show mercy. They had their reputations to think about, see. If one debt went unpaid, then others might follow in kind, and that they could not allow. So instead, they chose to take the only precious thing he had left. So, one night, once darkness fell, they descended upon the feeble, grimy shack the man called home, and tore his family from the filthy, coal-stained sacks that were their beds, before marching them, one by one, hands bound and tongues tied, into the depths of a half-constructed tunnel, where they knew they'd be left undisturbed. There they fixed 3 nooses to a support beam spanning its width, and holding the man's head in place, stretching his eyes wide open with foul fingers, they forced him to bear witness as one by one, his son, then his daughter, then his wife, were beaten bloody and secured by the neck. He begged then. He begged and he pleaded and he wailed. He took every pitiable treasure he could find from the folds of his clothes and held them up in ragged supplication, hoping beyond all hope to sway their hearts and buy a reprieve for his loved ones. It was all for naught, though, as one by one, first the boy, then the girl, then the wife, were hoisted up by the Bridport daggers that held them and left swinging till their pale, delicate faces turned purple and their tongues protruded from their mouths. Once it was done, they let him be at first, until his howls dwindled to sobs, then the sobs to whimpers, and the whimpers finally to silence. Then, when all the fight was gone from him, they formed a circle, raised their picks, and put him out of his misery. When the family was found missing the next day, their neighbours knew better than to ask any obvious questions, so soon enough they were all but forgotten. That was, of course, until years later, when the trains began running along the tracks laid by those men. Come the darkest edge of twilight, engine drivers coming through the now completed tunnel would often see the figure of a man, encrusted with grime and draped in ragged clothes, standing in the middle of the tracks, arms outstretched as if pleading inconsolably. In each case, they'd immediately slam on the brakes without any hope of stopping in time, and once the engine halted, they'd come down from their cabins to search for the shattered remains they were sure must cover the underside of their engine. Yet each time they came down, flustered and panicking, they'd find no sign of an impact. At first, these sightings were put down to drunkenness and lack of sleep, dismissed with a wave of the hand and a derisive snort. Soon enough, though, one too many drivers came back to the depot white-faced and shaking, telling the same story as those before them, and the fact of the matter was plain for all to see. No one talked about it, no one needed to, but from then on, any time one of their fellows walked into the small staff canteen with wide eyes and a quivering hand, someone would hand him a mug of tea, take him out for a smoke, and place a hand on their shoulder. After all, that's all anyone could do. Good jobs have always been scarce, and giving one up for a ghost is about as daft as you can get. Course, I wouldn't blame you if you sneered at this tale yourself. I certainly did. Then one day last winter I was cycling back from Wyke soon after darkness had fallen, the light from my head torch bouncing off the cold fog of my laboured breathing, when I saw what I first took to be a homeless man, ambling in front of me. Nowadays the trail is something of a haven to rough sleepers, offering as it does a little shelter from the biting coastal winds that sweep inland during the coldest months. I rang my bell, but I figured he couldn't have heard me, as he made no effort to move. So I rang it again, then finally I slowed enough to manoeuvre around him, and called, "Excuse me," as loudly as I could. I don't think he ever heard me, but as I passed I know he must have seen me, as that's when he lunged. It wasn't aggressive, just desperate, and to be honest I figured it was nothing more than the byproduct of white lightning and frustration. That was, of course, until I looked back and saw him, arms outstretched, an empty mouth agape, revealing a shapeless chasm behind a thin spectral mask. So, if you ever do come down to Weymouth, I'd recommend you take a walk down the Rodwell Trail. It is lovely after all, and full of plenty of sights to see. Just take my advice and make sure you're nowhere near that tunnel come nightfall.